Welcome back to our podcast. Picture ancient Greece, and you probably see philosophers in robes, marble columns, maybe some wine. What you don't picture is a room full of grown men lying sideways on couches, progressively losing the ability to form coherent arguments while insisting they've never been more articulate. That's the symposium, and it wasn't a party in any sense we'd recognize today. The word symposium sounds academic, refined, like something involving thoughtful discussion and measured debate. It was not. The Greeks used fancy terminology to disguise what was fundamentally a structured drinking session where social hierarchy melted, philosophical confidence inflated, and everyone pretended they'd remember the brilliant insights they were absolutely certain they were having. You didn't just show up to a symposium. You were invited carefully by men who wanted specific company for an evening of controlled chaos. The invitation implied intellectual engagement, maybe some light discourse about virtue or justice. What it actually promised was wine, lots of it, mixed with just enough water to keep everyone from immediate medical crisis. Food wasn't part of the equation. You ate dinner somewhere else, earlier, because the symposium existed for one purpose only: drinking while horizontal and seeing how long rational thought could survive, prolonged exposure to fermented grapes. When you arrived, a servant removed your shoes. This felt ceremonial until you realized it was practical. Floors got slippery. The room was arranged with couches lining the walls, creating an inward-facing ring where every participant could see everyone else. No hiding in corners. No escaping eye contact. Every word you said would be witnessed, remembered incorrectly, and possibly quoted back to you days later with alarming confidence. Chairs didn't exist here. Chairs implied structure, posture, self-control. The symposium rejected all three. You reclined on your left side, propped on one elbow, attempting to look natural while your body quietly filed complaints about this deeply unnatural position. Everyone else was doing the same thing, pretending this was comfortable, that lying sideways for hours while drinking and debating was perfectly reasonable. Your arm went numb almost immediately. You ignored it. Adjusting too much suggested weakness, and weakness invited philosophical attack. So, you committed. You leaned into the discomfort and told yourself this was fine. Reclining wasn't about comfort. It was about equality. When everyone's horizontal, no one towers over anyone else. Social hierarchy softened. Authority became conversational rather than imposed. Power flattened out across the couches. And for a few hours, status mattered less than the quality of your arguments, or at least the volume. The lighting was deliberately low, not romantic, strategic. When the evening progressed and judgment started declining, dim lighting meant facial expressions stayed ambiguous. You couldn't quite tell if someone was impressed, confused, or silently cataloguing your mistakes for future use. Servants moved through the room with practiced efficiency, stepping over sandals, dodging elbows, refilling cups without being asked. They'd done this before. They already knew who would become unbearable first, who would get louder, who would start repeating themselves with increasing conviction. At this stage, everyone was still coherent. Voices were calm. Laughter came in measured doses. Opinions were phrased carefully, politely, with just enough intellectual distance to suggest you were open to correction. This was the illusion phase, the part where everyone believed tonight would be different, refined, controlled. It lasted about 10 minutes. Then the wine arrived, carried in with ceremony, poured from a large communal bowl called a crater, and treated with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. This should have been your first warning. The Greeks didn't joke about wine. They respected it, feared it slightly, and understood that without proper handling, an evening could spiral from philosophical to catastrophic. You were assured, confidently, that the wine had been mixed with water. This was meant to be reassuring. It wasn't. Ancient Greek wine was nothing like modern wine. It was thicker, darker, more concentrated. Drinking it straight would turn a symposium into a medical emergency. Dilution wasn't moderation. It was survival protocol. The ratio varied depending on the host's intentions. Conservative mixing meant more water, slower descent into chaos. Ambitious mixing meant stronger wine, faster loosening of tongues, quicker arrival at the part where everyone became certain their ideas were revolutionary. You took your first sip carefully. It tasted sharp, earthy, faintly aggressive, like it resented caution. You nodded appreciatively anyway, as if you understood wine, as if you'd made an informed judgment about the vintage. Everyone else did the same. The room was full of men pretending expertise, nodding at flavors they couldn't actually distinguish. You told yourself you'd pace your drinking. This was a reasonable thought. It was also the last reasonable thought you'd have for several hours. Someone refilled your cup without asking. You hadn't finished the first one yet, but suddenly there was more. The cup was never empty long enough to feel lonely. You considered declining, but that would signal either arrogance or weakness, and neither was socially acceptable. So you accepted graciously, recalculated your mental limits, and pretended you were still in control. As the wine settled in, something shifted. You felt warmer, looser, more articulate. Your thoughts seemed clearer, sharper, more worthy of being spoken aloud. This was incorrect, but the confidence was convincing enough that you didn't question it. You began speaking more. Your gestures widened. Your voice gained weight, as if every sentence now carried inherent importance simply because you were the one saying it. Around the room, the same transformation was happening to everyone else. Laughter got louder. Interruptions became frequent. Agreements turned enthusiastic. Disagreements took on a personal edge they hadn't possessed 10 minutes earlier. The wine was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was lowering defenses, raising voices, and gently pushing everyone toward the edge of decorum where interesting things happened. You glanced at the communal bowl and realized it was already lower than it should be. Someone made a joke about it. Someone else refilled your cup again. You stopped counting. The symposium had crossed an invisible threshold. No one announced it. No one acknowledged it directly. But everyone felt it. The evening was no longer being guided by intention or structure. The wine had taken over, politely but firmly, and with everyone's full consent. At some point, someone decided the evening needed organization. This was adorable. In an effort to preserve some semblance of control, a symposiarch was appointed. One man, chosen either for his respectability, his intimidation factor, or simply because he was sitting closest to the wine bowl, was given the responsibility of regulating the drinking. He was supposed to set the pace, determine the wine-to-water ratio, and prevent the symposium from degenerating into complete philosophical anarchy. None of this would work, but the attempt was traditional. The symposiarch announced the rules. He spoke with authority, as if rules still functioned in a room full of men who'd already had several cups. He explained the mixing ratio, the timing of refills, the importance of moderation. Everyone nodded. These were ceremonial nods. They meant absolutely nothing. For approximately 5 minutes, the system appeared to function. Cups were filled carefully. Refills were spaced out. People pretended restraint was a shared value, that everyone was equally committed to maintaining dignity. Then someone laughed too hard at something that wasn't particularly funny. Someone else refilled their own cup without waiting. Then the symposiarch refilled his own cup, which undermined his authority significantly, but felt perfectly reasonable in the moment. You watched his control dissolve quietly. Guests began topping off their wine whenever a servant passed, treating the rules as suggestions rather than requirements. the way people treat speed limits on empty roads. The symposiarch attempted to reassert control. He cleared his throat meaningfully. He made a comment about the importance of pacing. Someone responded with a joke. The room laughed. The moment passed. From that point forward, the symposium ran on momentum rather than structure. Wine stacked in cups that were no longer being emptied before refilling. Conversations began overlapping aggressively. The room grew louder, warmer, more confident. The symposiarch gave up and reclined deeper into his couch, accepting his fate with the quiet dignity of someone who tried and failed honorably. The position of symposiarch existed not to actually maintain order, but to give the evening a brief head start before chaos arrived. It provided structure the way a thin rope provides structure to an avalanche. Symbolic, well-intentioned, ultimately irrelevant. You stopped paying attention to who was supposedly in charge. No one was. The wine decided things now, and strangely, this felt correct. The symposium was no longer pretending to be governed by reason or rules. It had reached its natural state, a room full of confident voices, loosened inhibitions, and cups that refilled themselves as if by divine intervention. Responsibility had its moment. It passed quietly, without protest, and what remained was exactly what everyone had secretly wanted all along. Freedom from restraint, permission to speak without filter, and the comforting illusion that tonight, finally, your ideas would be recognized as brilliant. The stage was set. The wine was flowing. And the real symposium was about to begin. Entertainment arrives, and with it, the pretense of sophistication collapses. A musician appears holding a lyre. He settles into position, adjusts his tuning pegs, and begins to play. You applaud politely, though you cannot honestly determine whether the instrument is being performed or interrogated. The notes drift across the room, mingling with wine vapors and half-formed thoughts. Music at a symposium is mandatory, not optional. It signals culture, refinement, the presence of elevated minds, or at least that's the theory. In practice, it provides something for everyone to nod along to without requiring actual comprehension. You tilt your head thoughtfully. You close your eyes briefly. You arrange your face into an expression that suggests deep appreciation for artistry. What you're actually thinking is that silence would be preferable. But silence is precisely what music prevents. It fills gaps, smooths transitions, gives the room a unified pulse. Without it, the symposium would fracture into isolated conversations and awkward pauses. Music binds the evening together, even when nobody particularly wants to be bound. The lyre player finishes a passage. You clap. Others join in. The musician interprets this as encouragement and continues immediately. There will be no escape. Then someone begins singing. Poetry, probably. The words are ancient, heavy with significance you're supposed to recognize. You don't. But you nod anyway, matching the rhythm with your head, pretending familiarity. Another voice joins in, slightly off-key but enthusiastic. The volume rises, confidence increases, accuracy does not. This is participation disguised as performance. The point is not beauty, the point is involvement, the creation of a shared experience that makes everyone feel they're contributing to something larger than themselves. Even if that something is just noise, you notice the servants moving through this chaos with remarkable composure. They've witnessed this exact scene countless times. They know how it ends. They refill cups, sidestep elbows, and maintain expressions of perfect neutrality. They are professionals navigating amateurs. The music grows bolder as wine loosens inhibitions. Someone starts tapping a rhythm on the couch frame. Someone else hums along incorrectly. A third person attempts to correct the melody, making it objectively worse. The lyre player accepts all of this with grace, continuing to play as if nothing unusual is happening. You begin swaying slightly, not because the music moves you, but because reclining while drinking has affected your equilibrium in ways you didn't anticipate. You tell yourself, this looks natural, that you're simply feeling the rhythm. You are not feeling the rhythm. You are feeling the wine. The atmosphere shifts. What began as entertainment has become texture. The music no longer stands apart from the evening. It blends into laughter, conversation, the splash of wine, the scrape of cups against stone. Everything merges into a single sensory experience. You clap again. The musician bows slightly. The symposium continues, louder now, more confident, less concerned with precision. Once music has softened judgment, and wine has convinced everyone of their excellent reflexes, somebody suggests games. This is the pivot point. The moment when the evening stops pretending to be about intellectual growth and admits what it actually is, a competition to prove things that don't need proving. The first game is simple, which makes it dangerous. You must flick wine from your cup toward a target placed across the room. Usually a small dish or shallow bowl balanced precariously on a stand. The rules are explained quickly, incompletely, and with far too much confidence. Accuracy is praised. Spillage is ignored. Mess is inevitable. You participate because refusal would suggest either cowardice or sobriety, both unacceptable in this context. You position your cup, adjust your angle, and flick. Wine arcs through the air. It misses the target entirely, splashing onto the floor near someone's foot. Nobody cares. In fact, someone cheers. This encourages you. You try again, this time with more force and less control. The target remains theoretical. Wine continues landing everywhere except where intended. The floor grows slick. Servants abandon cleaning and shift to crisis management. Another game emerges involving riddles. Someone poses a question designed to sound profound. It starts well. For approximately one round, answers are clever. Responses are measured. Everyone feels intellectually engaged. Then the riddles devolve. They become abstract, then confusing, then indistinguishable from random statements. You offer an answer anyway. Everyone nods as if you've said something meaningful. You haven't. But meaning is no longer the objective. The objective is noise, participation, the avoidance of silence. The room becomes animated. Reclining shifts to half-sitting. Half-sitting becomes leaning forward dangerously. Gestures widen. Cups tilt at angles that defy physics. You notice people laughing before punchlines arrive. Sometimes there is no punchline. Laughter comes anyway, summoned by atmosphere rather than humor. A competitive energy emerges. Someone insists on keeping score. This lasts approximately 30 seconds before disagreement erupts over rules nobody remembers establishing. Another person claims victory regardless. Nobody disputes it. Disputing would require effort. Wine is everywhere now. On hands, clothing, furniture, ideas. The floor reflects lamplight in wet patches. You feel unusually confident in your abilities. You are certain your aim has improved dramatically. It has not. You flick wine with theatrical flair and knock something over. It makes a sound suggesting importance. Brief pause, then laughter, encouraging laughter. This is how the games function. They strip away restraint, amplify confidence, and push everyone toward the edge of acceptable behavior before shoving them over. You are having fun. You are also making a complete fool of yourself. Both statements are accurate. Both feel correct. Just when the evening seems to have peaked at harmless chaos, philosophy barges in uninvited. It doesn't knock. It doesn't wait for permission. It simply arrives, settles between spilled cups, and demands attention. Someone clears their throat and announces a topic. Virtue, or justice, or love. The specific word doesn't matter. What matters is the tone, the sudden shift from games to gravity. You recognize the word immediately. This triggers a surge of confidence because you've heard it before, possibly multiple times. This convinces you that you're qualified to speak. You begin forming a sentence carefully. It starts with clarity. It ends somewhere completely different. Nobody notices because they're too busy constructing their own contributions, which they believe will be more profound than yours. Within moments, the room fills with opinions. Not arguments, opinions, loud ones. Everyone speaks as if discovering ancient wisdom in real time, even though half these ideas were borrowed from overheard conversations last week, and the other half were invented during the previous refill. You interrupt someone. They interrupt you back. This is not considered rude. This is engagement. Gestures become theatrical. You point dramatically. You wave expansively. You recline more aggressively, as if physical posture can reinforce intellectual position. At one point, you nearly knock your cup over. You catch it just in time. This feels like a significant achievement. You mention it. Nobody listens. They're too busy making their own points. Someone insists virtue can be taught. Someone else insists it cannot. A third person insists both positions are wrong, but offers no alternative explanation. You nod enthusiastically, because this somehow feels correct. The wine has reached a stage where every idea feels urgent. Every statement sounds profound. Silence becomes uncomfortable. You speak not because you have something to say, but because not speaking feels like losing. Across the room, someone laughs loudly at their own point. Another person applauds a statement they didn't fully hear. This is how consensus forms in wine-soaked rooms. The debate grows warmer, louder, increasingly personal. You feel passionate about something. What exactly remains unclear, but the feeling is undeniable. And then it happens. You say something you immediately believe is brilliant. It sounds right. It feels important. It lands with weight. For a brief moment, the room quiets. Someone nods. Someone else repeats part of what you said, but incorrectly. You don't correct them. You bask in this moment. Tomorrow you won't remember what you said. Tonight you're absolutely certain it changed everything. Philosophy has seized control of the symposium, and philosophy is drunk. Ugh. At some point, without announcement or decision, you begin speaking louder. This isn't conscious. It simply happens, the way tides rise, or bad ideas gain momentum after wine. In your mind, you're not shouting, you're projecting. There's a difference, and you're convinced everyone appreciates it. Your voice now carries across the entire room. This feels significant. You lean forward from your couch, gesturing broadly, as if volume alone can organize your thoughts into coherence. It cannot. But the effort is impressive to you. You notice that when you speak loudly, people look. This reinforces the behavior. Eye contact becomes validation. You pause for effect. The pauses stretch too long. Someone fills them. You raise your voice slightly to reclaim attention. This works briefly. Your arguments have simplified dramatically. Nuance has quietly left the room, taking logic with it. You no longer explain why you believe something. You simply state it firmly, as if firmness itself constitutes evidence. This is deeply satisfying. Around you, everyone has reached the same stage. Conversations overlap completely. Nobody listens fully. People respond to sentence fragments, nodding vigorously at points that were never actually made. Agreement and disagreement blur into a single loud activity. You laugh louder too. You're not entirely sure what's funny, but the timing feels appropriate. Someone else laughs with you. This creates a moment of shared joy you assume will be remembered fondly. It will not be remembered at all. Your gestures become ambitious. You knock something over again. This time you notice. You apologize with great enthusiasm and continue speaking without waiting for response. This is considered acceptable behavior. You are convinced your thoughts have never been clearer. You feel articulate, expressive, unstoppable. In reality, you are repeating yourself with increasing confidence and decreasing precision. This does not concern you. At one point you hear yourself talking and think, yes, this is exactly how a serious thinker sounds. This thought brings tremendous comfort. The room is now fully alive, loud, warm, vibrating with overlapping opinions. Wine cups are constantly refilled. Servants have stopped intervening. You are no longer participating in the symposium. You are the symposium, and somewhere deep inside, a quieter version of you is taking notes for tomorrow, though these notes will be completely ignored. That's when you notice him. There's always one man at every symposium who should not exist, while everyone else has gradually loosened, softened, and emotionally leaned into the wine. This man remains sharp, upright, annoyingly present. He drinks, yet nothing happens to him. You do not like this man. He reclines calmly, listening more than speaking. His eyes stay clear, his posture stays steady. He remembers names, he follows arguments, he reacts at appropriate moments. This is deeply unsettling. You glance at his cup, hoping to discover it's been secretly filled with water. It has not. Every time you make a bold claim, this man tilts his head slightly, not aggressively, not dismissively, thoughtfully. This is worse than disagreement. You cannot tell if he agrees, disagrees, or is simply cataloguing your mistakes for future reference. Someone asks him a question. He answers concisely, clearly, with terrifying coherence. The room quiets for a moment, recognizing something different. You feel a sudden urge to interrupt, not because you disagree, but because silence feels dangerous. You speak louder than intended. He looks at you again. This man will remember tonight. While others repeat themselves, exaggerate stories, and slowly unravel, he continues engaging with fresh points. You begin suspecting he's not drinking wine the way everyone else drinks wine. He's drinking it like a tool. This feels profoundly unfair. You reassure yourself that nobody will remember what you said earlier, that everything spoken here will dissolve by morning into vague impressions and wine-soaked regret. This belief collapses every time he nods, smiles faintly, or responds directly to something you said 10 minutes ago. Accurately, you avoid his gaze. You reposition on the couch, pretending your arm has gone numb again. You laugh loudly at a nearby joke, hoping distraction will save you. It does not. At some point, someone praises this man for his endurance. He shrugs modestly. You resent him for this too. The symposium continues around him like a storm, but he remains untouched, a calm center of memory and clarity. You realize with sinking certainty that tomorrow, when you struggle to recall the evening, this man will recall it for you. In detail, you decide to drink more. This seems like the correct response, because if one person is going to remember everything you said tonight, the least you can do is make sure you don't. At some point in the evening, usually between a particularly confident argument and a poorly aimed gesture, you notice something important by its absence. Respectable women are not here. This is not an oversight. This is policy. The symposium is a male space designed very carefully to be exactly that. Wives, daughters, and women of good standing remain elsewhere, protected from this spectacle, or perhaps protected from you. The Greeks call this order. You call it convenient because no one you actually have to face tomorrow is present to hear what you are saying tonight. The women who are present fall into very specific categories: musicians, entertainers, courtesans. They are educated, articulate, and far more sober than anyone on the couch is. This is not an accident. Someone has to remember how the night actually went. They move through the room with practiced calm, playing instruments, singing, refilling cups, observing. They laugh at the right moments. They listen closely. They make mental notes you will never have access to. You briefly convince yourself that this makes the symposium more philosophical. Fewer distractions, you think. Just men and ideas. This is incorrect. The real effect is that the room becomes louder, bolder, and significantly more confident in opinions that have not been stress-tested by reality. Someone makes a dramatic statement about love. You nod along enthusiastically, forgetting that no one present is allowed to challenge this perspective from experience. Another man declares something about women's nature. You agree reflexively because agreement is easier than thought at this point. The entertainers remain neutral. They have heard all of this before. Last week and the week before that, possibly from the same men, you attempt to impress one of them with an observation you are certain is clever. She smiles politely. This should concern you. It does not. The absence of respectable women creates a strange freedom. No restraint. No witnesses that matter. Opinions grow unchecked. Confidence inflates. The symposium becomes a sealed environment where ideas bounce around without resistance, growing louder and less accurate with every pass. You feel emboldened, safer, less accountable. This, you later realize, is exactly the problem. Because a room where only one kind of voice is allowed does not become wiser. It becomes louder. And tonight, volume is winning. By now, the room has changed. You can feel it. The air is thicker, heavier, layered with smoke, wine, sweat, and confidence. Lamps flicker. Shadows stretch along the walls. What once felt intimate now feels crowded, even though no one new has entered. This is what happens when too many opinions occupy too little space. You are warm, too warm. The kind of warm that makes you forget when you last felt comfortable. You shift on the couch trying to cool down without standing up, because standing up would involve consequences. You loosen your clothing slightly and immediately feel like this was the right decision. It was not. Voices overlap constantly now. Conversations no longer take turns. They collide. Someone laughs loudly from across the room, not because something was funny, but because laughter has become a reflex. You join in without knowing why. This feels natural. Emotions begin leaking into the discussions. What started as abstract ideas now sound suspiciously personal. A debate about justice turns into a complaint about unfair treatment. A discussion about virtue becomes an accusation. Someone mentions honor. Someone else takes it personally. You are not sure why, but you nod. You find yourself reacting faster than you think. Words leave your mouth before they are fully formed. You interrupt someone mid-sentence, then immediately forget what you were going to say. You fill the silence with volume. This seems effective. The heat makes everything feel urgent. Every statement sounds like it matters deeply. You are convinced that if you don't speak now, your thought will disappear forever. This is incorrect, but you speak anyway. Several people speak at once. No one wins. Someone slams a cup down for emphasis. Wine spills. No one cleans it up. That would slow things down. Another person leans forward dramatically, knocking knees with a neighbour. Apologies are exchanged loudly and immediately forgotten. You notice faces are redder now. Eyes are brighter. Movements are sharper. The symposium has reached emotional operating temperature. This is where things are said that will echo quietly later, usually at inconvenient times. You feel alive, engaged, fully present. You also feel a faint sense of danger, like standing too close to a fire you built yourself. The room is no longer just hosting the symposium. The room is the symposium, pulsing, loud, emotional, and one careless sentence away from becoming unforgettable. At some point, the argument you were passionately defending simply disappears. It doesn't end. It doesn't resolve. It just quietly slips out of your grasp, like a thought you were absolutely sure you had 5 seconds ago. This should alarm you. It does not. What remains is confidence. Pure, undiluted confidence. You no longer remember what started the debate, but you are certain you were correct. You feel this deeply, in your bones, in your gestures, in the way you nod while someone else speaks, as if confirming points that may or may not align with what you were previously saying. Someone challenges you. You respond immediately without hesitation. The response is firm, decisive, and completely unrelated to the challenge. No one points this out. That would slow the momentum. Momentum is sacred. Now you begin repeating yourself. This feels intentional, like emphasis. You believe repetition adds strength. It does not, but the conviction behind it is impressive. Each time you restate your point, you do so louder, as if volume might summon clarity back into existence. Around the room, the same phenomenon is unfolding. Everyone has lost the thread, but no one has lost certainty. Statements float freely, detached from evidence, context, or even grammar. They collide occasionally and are immediately applauded. You hear yourself say something and think, yes, exactly, that's what I meant. Even though you have no idea what you meant, someone agrees with you enthusiastically. This feels validating. You do not question why they agree or what they think you said. Agreement is enough. You are no longer debating ideas, you are defending a feeling. The feeling that you are right and that this matters. Silence feels threatening. You fill it quickly. Others do the same. The room hums with overlapping declarations, none of which require follow-up. You lean back, satisfied. Your work here is done. You have contributed meaningfully to the evening's intellectual atmosphere. You know this because you feel very sure about it. Somewhere nearby, someone is still sober enough to notice the disconnect. You do not look at them. The symposium has reached a crucial stage. The point where clarity is gone, memory is unreliable, but confidence has achieved total independence. This is dangerous territory, but it feels incredible. Eventually, the symposium does not end. It simply loses momentum and collapses inward like a tired argument that can no longer support itself. No one announces that it's time to leave. People just begin failing to continue. You attempt to sit up fully. This was a mistake. Your body responds with a brief but firm reminder that reclining sideways for hours while drinking was not part of its design specifications. You pause, pretending this hesitation was intentional. No one questions it. Several people are doing the same thing. Around the room, conversations trail off mid-sentence. Someone begins a thought, forgets it halfway through, and replaces it with laughter. Another person stands up too fast, immediately regrets it, and pretends they were just stretching philosophically. A servant appears with a lamp. This is the universal signal. The night has entered its final phase. Assisted departure. The servant does not ask if you need help. They already know. You rise carefully, one limb at a time, negotiating with gravity, as if it might be open to compromise. The floor feels farther away than expected. The couch, which betrayed you earlier, now tries to pull you back in. You refuse. Shoes are returned to you. You stare at them briefly, as if unsure what their purpose is. Eventually, you put them on. Not correctly, but adequately. Outside, the night air hits you with brutal honesty. It is colder, sharper, and far less impressed by your confidence. You inhale deeply and immediately regret it. The wine does not appreciate fresh air. Someone places a steadying hand on your arm. You accept this without comment. Independence is no longer a priority. As you walk, the street seems longer than it was on the way in. The lamplight sways, shadows stretch. You feel both deeply thoughtful and profoundly empty. This feels philosophical, so you decide not to question it. You attempt to recall the evening. You remember fragments, laughter, strong opinions. The sober man's face. Something you said that felt important. The details are gone, but the certainty remains that you were brilliant. Your escort listens patiently as you summarize your own thoughts to yourself out loud. They do not respond. This is kindness. When you finally reach your door, you pause. You feel like something meaningful has happened, something lasting, something worth remembering. You will not remember it. Tomorrow you will wake with a headache, a dry mouth, and the vague suspicion that you owe someone an apology, though you will not be sure who. Tonight, however, you are convinced the symposium was a success. You survived it, and that in ancient Greece counted as participation. Morning arrives with absolutely no regard for what you did the night before. There is no gentle transition, no respectful pause. You wake up as if summoned by an angry god who has reviewed your behavior and found it disappointing. Your head hurts in a way that feels philosophical. Your mouth is dry. Your eyes resist opening, and your body refuses to cooperate without negotiation. You lie still for a moment, hoping this is temporary. It is not. As memory returns, it does so selectively and cruelly. You remember confidence. You remember volume. You remember being absolutely certain you were correct. You do not remember why. Fragments surface. A gesture, a laugh that went on too long, a sentence that began with conviction and ended somewhere unsafe. You replay moments, hoping clarity will arrive. Instead, you discover only new layers of regret. You sit up slowly. This feels like a mistake, but you continue anyway. The room tilts slightly as if offering commentary. You take this as criticism. Now comes the real danger. Running into people. Every passerby feels like a potential witness. Did they hear you last night? Did they hear about you last night? You scan faces for recognition, judgment, or worse, amusement. Someone greets you warmly. This does not reassure you. Warmth suggests memory. You attempt to reconstruct the symposium logically. There was wine. There was debate. There was laughter. At some point, you were winning an argument. You are sure of this. The lack of evidence does not trouble you. It simply annoys you. Then you remember him, the sober man, the one who listened, the one who nodded, the one who will remember everything you said accurately and without mercy. You feel a chill unrelated to the morning air. You consider avoiding him indefinitely. Throughout the day, ordinary tasks feel heavier. Conversations feel louder. Every sound feels personal. You promise yourself you will never drink that much again. This promise feels sincere and will last until the next invitation. By evening, the worst of the discomfort fades, leaving behind a familiar sense of resignation. Whatever you said, it's too late now. The symposium has passed into memory. Yours fractured and forgiving, others precise and permanent. You tell yourself this is part of the process. This is how ideas are tested. This is how men learn. Mostly, this is how men learn to pace their drinking. You survive the morning. You survive the day. And by nightfall, you almost believe you do it all again. With a little distance and a lot of water, you begin to understand what last night really was. It was not chaos. It was not refinement either. It was something in between. A strange human machine that turned wine, voices, ego, and time into ideas that occasionally mattered. Ancient Greek parties did not produce philosophy because everyone behaved well. They produced philosophy because people didn't. Ideas were not born in silence or calm contemplation. They emerged from argument, contradiction, exaggeration, and the sheer refusal to stop talking, even when logic had clearly left the building. You did not attend the symposium to find truth. You attended to test it, loudly, imperfectly, and in front of witnesses. You threw thoughts into the room the way others threw wine. Carelessly, enthusiastically, and with very little concern for cleanup. Most of what was said last night will never matter. It will dissolve into jokes, retellings, and second-hand embarrassment. But a few fragments will linger. A question, a challenge, a contradiction. Someone will remember them. Someone will revisit them sober. Someone will write them down later, minus the slurring and confidence. This is the part history prefers not to mention. The great ideas of ancient Greece did not emerge fully formed from serene minds. They were hammered out in rooms like this. Smoky, loud, uncomfortable rooms where men reclined awkwardly, drank too much, interrupted each other, and mistook confidence for insight, until insight occasionally appeared by accident. You were not attending a party. You were participating in a social engine. The symposium was a place where hierarchy softened, restraint loosened, and voices collided without a clear winner. It allowed people to say the wrong thing loudly enough for someone else to correct it later. That correction, not the original speech, is what survived. From nights like this came philosophy, politics, theatre, and art. Not because the environment was ideal, but because it was human, messy, emotional, flawed, repetitive, loud. So when you imagine ancient Greek parties, do not picture calm men in white robes nodding thoughtfully. Picture a room full of confidence, spilled wine, half-finished thoughts, and one man who remembers everything. Picture ideas being born not from order but from friction. You were not there to behave. You were there to contribute, even badly. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. The symposium was never designed for perfection. It was designed for collision. Think of it as intellectual sparring, where nobody wins cleanly, but everyone leaves bruised enough to think harder next time. The wine was not incidental, it was central. Alcohol lowered defenses just enough to make dangerous ideas feel safe to express. Without wine, the symposium becomes a lecture. With too much, it becomes chaos. The Greeks understood this balance instinctively, even if they violated it constantly. They built a system that encouraged risk, knowing most risks would fail, but a few would reshape thought entirely. The morning after is when the real work begins, not in the headache or the regret, but in the quiet reassembly of what was actually said versus what was actually meant. Memory becomes an editor, cutting excess, sharpening focus, and occasionally inventing coherence where none existed. This is where philosophy solidifies, not in the moment of drunken proclamation, but in the sober reflection that follows. The symposium provided raw material. The morning provided perspective. What emerges is not the original argument, but something refined through embarrassment, contradiction, and the terrifying possibility that the sober man might actually repeat what you said. Ancient Greeks did not write philosophy during symposia. They wrote it afterward, when shame and clarity combined to produce something stronger than either alone. The party was the forge. The morning was the anvil. This pattern repeated across generations. Young men attended their first symposium nervous, uncertain, determined to impress. They spoke too much or too little. They drank poorly. They misunderstood points and made themselves memorable for all the wrong reasons. But they returned, again and again, each time slightly better at navigating the chaos. Each time understanding more about when to speak, when to listen, and when to simply let the room collapse under its own momentum. The symposium was training. Not for drinking, though that happened. Not for debating, though that too. It was training for thinking publicly, for defending ideas under pressure, for recognizing when confidence had outpaced competence. It taught humility through humiliation. It taught clarity through confusion. And it taught that the best ideas often emerge not from the smartest person in the room, but from the collision of many imperfect thoughts spoken just recklessly enough to matter. The legacy of these gatherings is impossible to separate from Western intellectual tradition. Plato wrote his dialogues as if they were symposia on paper. Aristotle structured his school around conversation and debate. Centuries of philosophy emerged not from isolated genius, but from men arguing badly until someone argued well enough to be remembered. Modern academic conferences owe more to ancient symposia than they admit. The format has changed. The wine has been replaced by coffee. But the core remains. Ideas tested publicly, challenged immediately, and refined through friction. What the Greeks understood, and what we often forget, is that thinking is social. Not because truth requires consensus, but because error requires exposure. You cannot see your own blind spots. You need someone else, preferably someone who has also drunk too much, to point them out with absolutely no tact. The symposium was not polite, it was effective. It did not produce comfort, it produced thought. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Progress is not comfortable, it is not orderly. It does not emerge from quiet rooms where everyone agrees. It emerges from noise, conflict, wine, and the willingness to look foolish in front of people who will remember. That is what ancient Greek parties were actually like. The symposium was more than a social ritual. It was a crucible where reputation could be forged or destroyed in a single evening. Every man who entered that room understood the stakes. What you said mattered less than how you defended it. Confidence could cover ignorance. Silence suggested weakness. And weakness, once exposed, followed you far beyond the next morning. In ancient Athens, where democracy meant public debate and citizenship demanded participation, the ability to argue was survival. Courts had no lawyers. Citizens prosecuted and defended themselves before hundreds of jurors. Political decisions were made in assemblies where anyone could speak, and persuasion determined outcomes. The symposium became training ground for this reality. If you could defend an idea while drunk, reclined, and surrounded by hostile voices, you could defend it anywhere. Young men attended symposia not just for wine or entertainment. They came to learn how their elders spoke, how arguments were constructed, how authority was challenged without crossing into disrespect. They watched older men dominate conversations through timing, tone, and strategic concessions. They learned that admitting small errors could strengthen larger claims, that interrupting at the right moment could derail an opponent. That laughter, deployed correctly, could destroy credibility faster than logic. This was education without teachers. The room itself taught. Every mistake was visible, every weakness exploited. If you misspoke, someone repeated it back to you incorrectly, forcing you to clarify under pressure. If you hesitated, someone filled the silence with their own interpretation. The symposium demanded quick thinking, not just quick drinking. Women's absence from these gatherings was not coincidental. Greek society separated spaces strictly. The home belonged to women. The public sphere belonged to men. The symposium sat between both, a private gathering with public consequences. What happened there shaped politics, law, and philosophy, but it happened without female voices challenging male assumptions. This created an echo chamber where certain ideas went untested, certain perspectives remained invisible. The women who were present, musicians and courtesans, occupied a different category entirely. They were educated, often more so than the wives who stayed home. Some became famous for their wit and intelligence, but they were not citizens. They could not vote, own property, or speak in assemblies. Their presence at symposia was tolerated, even valued, but never equal. They entertained, observed, and occasionally participated, but always from the margins. This imbalance shaped Greek thought in ways we still inherit. Entire philosophical traditions emerged from rooms where only one gender was allowed to speak freely. Ideas about virtue, justice, and the good life were debated exclusively by men, then codified as universal truths. The symposium was powerful, but it was also limited by who was permitted to enter. The physical arrangement of the room reinforced these dynamics. Couches placed along walls created a circle where everyone faced inward. No one could hide. Every expression was visible. Every reaction noted. This forced intimacy bred both honesty and performance. You could not pretend disinterest. The room demanded engagement. Servants moved through this space constantly, refilling cups, clearing debris, maintaining the infrastructure that allowed the symposium to function. They were present but invisible, acknowledged only when needed. Their labour made the evening possible, yet they were excluded from the conversations their work sustained. Another layer of hierarchy, another group whose voices did not matter. The wine itself played a deliberate role, diluted enough to maintain coherence, but strong enough to lower inhibitions. It created a specific psychological state. Not drunkenness, but looseness. Enough to make bold claims feel natural. Enough to speak truths, usually left unspoken. The Greeks understood intoxication as a tool, not an accident. They controlled it, managed it, weaponized it. Different symposia had different characters depending on who attended. Philosophical gatherings skewed toward abstract debate. Political symposia focused on strategy and gossip. Artistic circles discussed poetry and performance. But the format remained consistent. Reclining, wine, conversation, and the understanding that what was said tonight mattered tomorrow. Some men built entire careers on symposium performances. Alcibiades, the brilliant and controversial Athenian general, was famous for his symposium appearances. He used these gatherings to charm, intimidate, and manipulate. His presence changed the energy of any room. People attended symposia hoping to see him speak, argue, or simply dominate through charisma. He understood that power was not just political, it was social, performed nightly in private homes. Others avoided symposia entirely, recognizing them as dangerous. Socrates attended frequently, but remained famously sober, watching others unravel while he stayed sharp. This made him unpopular. His refusal to participate fully in the ritual felt like judgment. He asked questions instead of making declarations. He exposed contradictions instead of offering solutions. This approach worked philosophically, but failed socially. Eventually, Athens executed him. The symposium also had a darker side. Violence occasionally erupted. Arguments turned physical. Insults became unforgivable. Men who felt dishonored during symposia sometimes sought revenge outside them. Feuds began over drunken slights. Alliances fractured over misunderstood jokes. The wine that loosened tongues also removed filters, and words spoken carelessly could not be unsaid. Sexual dynamics complicated things further. Greek attitudes towards sexuality differed radically from modern ones. Relationships between older men and younger men were common, expected, even idealized in certain contexts. The symposium was where these relationships were often initiated, negotiated, or displayed. Power imbalances were built into the system. Older men held authority. Younger men sought mentorship and status. The line between education and exploitation was not always clear. This atmosphere of competition, intoxication, and unequal power created moments of genuine insight alongside moments of genuine harm. The symposium was not inherently good or bad. It was human, messy, productive, dangerous, and necessary all at once. As the night progressed and wine flowed freely, conversations shifted from abstract philosophy to personal attacks. Someone would make a claim. Someone else would challenge not the claim but the person making it. Suddenly the debate was no longer about justice, but about who had the authority to speak on justice. Character became evidence. Reputation became argument. This is where the symposium revealed its true nature. It was not about discovering truth. It was about establishing dominance. Ideas were weapons. Logic was armor. And the goal was not enlightenment, but victory. To win an argument at a symposium was to leave with enhanced status. To lose was to become material for future jokes. The morning after, when memories were fragmented and heads ached, the real assessment began. Who had spoken well? Who had embarrassed themselves? Who had revealed something they should not have? These evaluations spread through the city. Reputations rose and fell based on symposium performances. A single brilliant argument could launch a political career. A single drunken mistake could end one. This system was brutal but effective. It forced men to think on their feet, defend unpopular positions, and refine arguments under pressure. It created a culture where rhetoric mattered as much as truth, where performance was inseparable from philosophy. The greatest thinkers were also the greatest speakers. Ideas that could not survive the symposium did not survive at all. Yet this same system excluded anyone who did not fit its narrow parameters. Women, slaves, foreigners, and the poor had no access to this training ground. Their ideas, if they had them, remained unspoken and unrecorded. Greek philosophy emerged from a fraction of the population debating amongst themselves, convinced they represented universal humanity. The symposium's legacy is therefore complicated. It produced extraordinary intellectual achievements, but it also reinforced hierarchies that limited who could contribute to those achievements. It celebrated free speech while restricting who was free to speak. It valued debate while silencing entire categories of people. Modern education still carries traces of this model. Seminars, conferences, and academic debates all descend from the symposium tradition. We still value the ability to argue publicly. We still judge ideas partly by how well they are defended. We still create spaces where certain voices dominate while others remain marginal. Understanding the symposium means understanding this tension. It was a space of both liberation and limitation. It freed men to speak boldly, but only certain men. It encouraged intellectual risk, but only within strict social boundaries. It was revolutionary and conservative simultaneously, pushing thought forward while preserving power structures. The symposium did not invent philosophy. Philosophy existed before symposia and beyond Greece, but the symposium shaped how Western philosophy developed. It privileged certain styles of thinking, debate-driven, adversarial, concerned with winning arguments as much as finding truth. It created an intellectual culture where being right mattered less than proving you were right. This approach has strengths. It forces clarity. It exposes weak reasoning. It demands that ideas be defensible, not just plausible. But it also has costs. It privileges aggression over contemplation. It rewards confidence over doubt. It makes philosophy a competitive sport rather than a collaborative search. Looking back at ancient Greek parties, we see not just wine and philosophy, but the birth of an intellectual tradition still shaping how we think, argue, and decide what counts as knowledge. The symposium was not perfect, but it was powerful, and its influence, for better and worse, remains inescapable. The wine-soaked symposia that produced Greek philosophy were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader pattern that shaped Mediterranean intellectual life for centuries. But what happened when this tradition encountered other cultures? What occurred when Greek thinking collided with different ways of understanding the world? Alexander the Great's conquests fundamentally altered the symposium's role. As Greek culture spread eastward, the institution travelled with it. But it did not arrive unchanged. In Alexandria, symposia blended with Egyptian traditions of banquet halls and religious feasting. In Persia, they merged with existing court rituals, where wine and conversation had long been intertwined with governance. The result was not pure Greek culture transplanted. It was hybrid spaces, where multiple traditions coexisted uncomfortably. Egyptian priests attended symposia, but brought their own cosmological frameworks. Persian nobles reclined alongside Greek philosophers, but interpreted debates through different lenses. The symposium became a site of translation as much as discussion. This cultural mixing produced unexpected innovations. The Library of Alexandria emerged partly from symposium culture. Scholars gathered not just to read, but to debate interpretations over wine. The museum attached to the library functioned as a permanent symposium, a place where ideas were tested through conversation rather than solitary study. But translation was never perfect. Greek concepts did not map cleanly onto other languages. When symposium debates were translated into Aramaic or Coptic, meanings shifted. Words that carried specific philosophical weight in Greek became approximate in other tongues. Arguments that seemed clear in Athens became ambiguous in Babylon. This ambiguity was not always negative. It created space for reinterpretation. Eastern thinkers absorbed Greek ideas, but bent them toward different purposes. Logic was applied to theology. Rhetoric was used to defend religious positions. Philosophy became a tool for multiple traditions simultaneously. Rome inherited the symposium, but transformed it fundamentally. Where Greeks emphasized equality among participants, Romans reinforced hierarchy. Seating positions at Roman banquets indicated status precisely. Who reclined where mattered as much as what was discussed. The symposium became theatre of power rather than space of shared inquiry. Roman adaptations also made the symposium more formal. Rules multiplied. Etiquette became rigid. What had been fluid in Greece became structured in Rome. This structure served imperial purposes. Symposia became places where loyalty was demonstrated, alliances formed, and political positions signalled through careful participation. Yet something was lost in translation. The willingness to be proven wrong, central to Greek symposia, vanished in Roman versions. Romans attended banquets to display knowledge, not question it. Debates became performances rather than genuine investigations. Winning mattered more than learning. Christianity's rise complicated the symposium tradition further. Early Christian communities held their own communal meals, agape feasts that superficially resembled symposia. But the purpose differed fundamentally. Where symposia celebrated intellectual conflict, agape feasts emphasized unity. Where wine loosened tongues for debate, it now symbolized shared faith. Christian writers borrowed symposium forms, but inverted their content. Augustine wrote dialogues structured like symposium conversations, but his characters reached predetermined conclusions rather than genuine uncertainty. The form remained while the spirit changed. Debate became didactic rather than exploratory. This transformation was not accidental. Christianity valued authority over inquiry. Questions were meant to lead toward established truth, not open-ended exploration. The symposium's inherent unpredictability became threatening rather than valuable. Wine's role shifted from intellectual catalyst to moral danger. Medieval monasteries preserved symposium texts, but not practices. Monks copied Plato's dialogues without hosting wine-fueled debates. The written record survived while the lived experience vanished. Philosophy became something read rather than performed. Ideas were encountered on pages rather than across couches, yet echoes persisted. Medieval universities developed disputation practices that descended distantly from symposia. Students argued formal positions before audiences, but these were sober affairs, carefully structured, with outcomes often predetermined. The wine was gone. The reclining was gone. Only the argumentative structure remained. Islamic culture encountered Greek symposium traditions through translations. Arabic scholars read symposium dialogues and recognized something familiar. Persian and Arabic literary traditions already included wine poetry and philosophical gatherings. The symposium was not foreign, but parallel. This created unique synthesis. Islamic scholars hosted their own learned gatherings where wine, poetry, and philosophy mixed. But religious prohibitions on alcohol created tension. Some gatherings were metaphorical, using wine as symbol rather than substance. Others occurred in private, hidden from public scrutiny. The symposium's legacy in Islamic culture was therefore complicated. The intellectual tradition was embraced. The social practice was modified. Debates continued, but under different conditions. The search for knowledge remained central, while the methods of intoxication became controversial. Renaissance Europe rediscovered symposium traditions through ancient texts. Humanist scholars read Plato and tried reconstructing the experience, but their attempts were sanitized. Renaissance symposia featured intellectual conversation without genuine drunkenness. They were theatrical recreations rather than authentic revivals. What emerged instead was the salon, a descendant of the symposium adapted for different social conditions. Salons maintained conversation as central activity, but added restraint. Women could now participate, fundamentally altering dynamics. Hierarchy remained but operated differently. Status came from wit rather than philosophical training. The coffeehouse became another symposium successor. Coffee replaced wine, but the structure persisted. Men gathered in public spaces to debate, argue, and exchange ideas. Conversation remained central, but sobriety changed everything. Arguments became sharper, less forgiving. The buffer that wine provided disappeared. These transformations reveal something crucial about the symposium's original function. It was not just intellectual exchange, it was a specific form of social interaction that required particular conditions. Remove the wine, change the participants, formalize the structure, and something essential vanishes. Modern academia still carries symposium traces, but heavily modified. Conferences echo the gathering of minds. Seminars maintain the conversational format. But professional pressures and institutional structures constrain what can be said. Tenure concerns, publication requirements, and career advancement shape participation in ways ancient Greeks never faced. The symposium's most radical element, its embrace of productive chaos, has largely disappeared. Modern intellectual culture values control, predictability, measurable outcomes. The idea that important insights might emerge from wine-soaked arguments between half-drunk men seems unprofessional at best, dangerous at worst. Yet something was lost in this professionalization. The symposium's power came partly from its lack of structure. Ideas emerged from genuine unpredictability. Arguments went in unexpected directions. Wine removed inhibitions that might otherwise prevent radical questions. The chaos was not incidental, but essential. Consider what modern intellectual culture gained and lost in abandoning symposium methods. We gained rigor, reproducibility, systematic investigation. We lost spontaneity, risk-taking, willingness to appear foolish. We gained respect for evidence. We lost comfort with uncertainty. The symposium valued process over outcome. Conversations mattered more than conclusions. Being proven wrong was educational rather than shameful. This attitude is nearly impossible to maintain in contemporary academic settings where careers depend on being right, publishing successfully, and defending positions against criticism. The symposium also assumed leisure. Participants had time to drink, debate, and wander through ideas without immediate pressure to produce results. This leisure was enabled by slavery and gender exclusion, but it also created space for thought that our productivity-obsessed culture cannot replicate. Modern attempts to recreate symposium conditions often fail because they cannot reproduce the social context. Academic workshops try encouraging free discussion, but participants remain aware of professional consequences. Informal gatherings among scholars approach the spirit, but lack the symposium's deliberate structure. Something about the original combination remains elusive. Perhaps the symposium cannot be revived because its preconditions no longer exist. We cannot unknow professional structures. We cannot pretend ideas have no consequences. We cannot separate intellectual performance from career advancement. The symposium belonged to a specific historical moment that has passed. Yet its legacy persists in unexpected ways. The ideal of free inquiry, the value placed on debate, the belief that truth emerges from conflict rather than authority, these symposium principles still shape how we think about intellectual work. Even if we cannot recreate the practice, we inherit the values. The symposium reminds us that knowledge production is always social. Ideas emerge from interactions, not isolated contemplation. Thinking happens in conversation, through challenge and response, amid the friction of differing perspectives. This insight remains relevant regardless of whether wine is involved. It also reveals that different social arrangements produce different kinds of knowledge. The symposium's particular combination of equality, intoxication, and competition generated specific philosophical approaches. Change those conditions and different ideas emerge. Our intellectual culture's blind spots reflect our own social structures as much as the symposium's reflected ancient Greek society. Understanding the symposium's transformations across cultures and centuries illuminates how ideas travel and mutate. Philosophical traditions are not abstract entities floating above history. They are embodied practices tied to specific social forms. When those forms change, the ideas change too, sometimes in ways barely visible to participants. The symposium story is therefore not just about ancient Greece. It is about how intellectual traditions emerge, spread, adapt, and eventually transform beyond recognition while maintaining some core identity. It shows that the line between intellectual content and social context is far blurrier than we typically acknowledge. Understanding how intellectual traditions connect also means tracking what gets lost. Not every idea from the symposium survived into written form. Most vanished completely. What remains comes filtered through philosophers who chose carefully what deserved recording. This selection process was never neutral. Writers preserved ideas that aligned with their own philosophical commitments. Arguments they found compelling received detailed treatment. Positions they considered weak were summarized dismissively or ignored entirely. The written record therefore reflects not what was said at symposia, but what certain thinkers believed worth remembering. This filtering had profound consequences. Entire schools of thought disappeared because their adherents never wrote extensively or because their texts were later lost. We know some philosophers only through hostile accounts written by opponents. Their actual positions remain speculative, reconstructed from fragments and criticism. Gender bias shaped preservation dramatically. Women occasionally participated in philosophical discussions, particularly courtesans educated in rhetoric and debate. Some became respected thinkers, yet their contributions were rarely recorded with the same seriousness as male philosophers. When mentioned at all, women appeared as exceptions, curiosities, or moral examples rather than intellectual equals. This erasure was systematic. Even accomplished female thinkers like Diotima, whose ideas influence Plato's theory of love, exist primarily through male interpretation. Whether she was historical or fictional remains debated. Her voice reaches us only through Socrates' retelling, mediated and possibly transformed. The symposium's physical setting also influenced what survived. Conversations happened in private homes, not public spaces. No official records existed. Memory and later retellings determined what endured. This meant dramatic moments, clever comebacks, and memorable arguments had better survival odds than careful systematic reasoning. Philosophical writing developed partly to overcome this limitation. By recording arguments in dialogue form, thinkers like Plato created permanent versions of symposium-style exchanges. But these written dialogues were stylized reconstructions, not transcripts. They shaped debates to serve pedagogical purposes, emphasizing clarity and structure over the messy reality of actual conversation. The transition from oral to written philosophy changed how ideas developed. Oral culture valued memory, repetition, and performance. Arguments were tested through immediate response and collective evaluation. Writing allowed solitary reflection, revision, and systematic organization. The shift privileged different kinds of thinking. Written philosophy could be more complex. Arguments could span pages, building carefully toward conclusions. But writing also lost something vital: the energy of live debate, the spontaneity of unexpected objections, the social pressure that forced clarity. These disappeared when philosophy moved onto the page. Modern scholars studying ancient philosophy therefore face a paradox. The texts we analyze represent only what certain people thought worth writing about ideas that may have been discussed very differently in actual symposia. We study the archive while knowing the archive is incomplete, biased, and transformed from its original context. Archaeological evidence provides some corrective. Symposium vessels survive, decorated with scenes showing actual drinking practices. Inscriptions record names and relationships. Physical spaces can be excavated, revealing room layouts and furniture arrangements. Material culture speaks where texts remain silent, but material evidence has limits. Objects show how symposia were conducted, not what was said. We see the stage, but cannot hear the performance. Physical remains confirm the social practice existed, but cannot recover the intellectual content. This tension between presence and absence defines ancient intellectual history. We know something important happened at symposia. We know ideas emerged that shaped Western thought profoundly. But we cannot fully reconstruct the actual conversations. What survives is already interpretation, selection, transformation. Recognizing these gaps matters because it forces humility. Grand narratives about the birth of Western philosophy rest on fragmentary evidence. The story we tell is necessarily partial, shaped by who had power to write and whose writing survived. Other voices existed. Other arguments were made. They simply did not make it through the historical filter. This loss extends beyond individuals to entire ways of thinking. Some philosophical approaches may have flourished at symposia, but failed to translate into written form. Styles of reasoning that depended on performance, emotion, or immediate context could not survive transcription. We inherit only what worked on the page. The relationship between drinking and philosophy also became sanitized in written accounts. Plato's Symposium acknowledges wine, but emphasizes rational discourse. The messiness, aggression, and irrationality that surely characterized many actual symposia appear minimized or moralized. Philosophy presented itself as sober, even when discussing drunken conversations. This sanitization served professional purposes. As philosophy claimed authority as a discipline, it needed to distinguish itself from mere entertainment or social gathering. Emphasizing reason over revelry made the practice appear serious, worthy of respect and patronage. The symposium's rowdier aspects became embarrassing rather than essential. Later traditions inherited this sanitized version. When Romans adopted symposium practices, they often emphasized the intellectual aspects while treating drinking as secondary. Medieval scholars studying ancient texts, found philosophical content, but missed the social context. The symposium became a literary genre more than a lived practice. Yet something of the original spirit persisted. The dialogue form itself retained traces of oral exchange. Even written philosophy often imagined an audience, anticipated objections and structured arguments as if responding to another voice. The symposium's conversational nature left permanent marks on how Western philosophy presents itself. The emphasis on debate, on testing ideas through opposition, became foundational. Philosophy defined itself as dialectical, moving through argument and counter-argument toward truth. This approach reflects symposium practice directly. Ideas emerged not from isolated contemplation but from social friction, from the collision of different perspectives. This legacy matters because it shaped what philosophy could become. Other cultures developed different intellectual traditions based on different social practices. Meditation, ritual, or individual study produced different philosophical styles. The symposium's influence made Western philosophy distinctively argumentative, competitive, and public. Modern academic philosophy inherits these characteristics clearly. Seminars resemble symposia structurally, though without wine. Papers are presented, challenged, defended. Careers advance through successful debate. The ability to respond to objections remains valued. Philosophy still happens primarily through structured conversation. But the modern version lacks the symposium's egalitarian potential. Academic hierarchy creates clear power dynamics. Junior scholars cannot challenge senior ones freely. Professional consequences constrain intellectual risk-taking. The symposium's temporary leveling, achieved through shared intoxication and physical equality, cannot be replicated in institutional settings. This difference highlights what made the symposium unique. For a few hours, normal social hierarchies softened. Wealth mattered less. Age mattered less. Even expertise mattered less. What counted was the quality of argument delivered in the moment. This temporary suspension of hierarchy created space for ideas that might not emerge in more rigidly structured environments. Of course, this egalitarianism had strict limits. Women, slaves, and non-citizens remained excluded. The leveling happened only among free men of similar status. But within that restricted group, the symposium offered unusual intellectual freedom. This partial openness may explain why it generated so much creative thought. The tension between inclusion and exclusion shaped what the symposium could achieve. Limited participation meant shared cultural assumptions, making communication easier. Everyone understood references, recognized arguments, and operated within common frameworks. This shared background accelerated debate, yet homogeneity also limited perspective. Ideas rarely faced challenge from truly different worldviews. Foreign philosophies, alternative cultural assumptions, and radically different experiences remained largely absent. The symposium generated impressive thought within its boundaries, but rarely questioned those boundaries themselves. This limitation became invisible to participants. From inside the practice, the symposium felt universal, representing human reason generally. Only later, when other cultures and perspectives became visible, did the narrowness become apparent. What seemed like philosophy itself was actually one culture's particular approach. Modern readers encounter this tension constantly. Ancient texts address universal questions, but from positions shaped by specific historical circumstances. The challenge involves extracting insights while recognizing limitations. Neither dismissing ancient thought as hopelessly biased, nor accepting it uncritically works. The truth lies somewhere between. The symposium's legacy therefore remains complicated. It gave Western philosophy distinctive characteristics that still influence how we think. But it also embedded biases and blindnesses that took centuries to recognize and longer to address. Understanding this mixed inheritance matters for anyone engaging with philosophical tradition. What survives from ancient symposia is not pure thought, but thought shaped by specific social practices. To understand the ideas properly requires understanding the context that produced them. This means taking drinking seriously, recognizing exclusion honestly, and acknowledging that much was lost. Perhaps most importantly, it means recognizing that intellectual traditions are always embodied in social forms. How we organize thinking shapes what we can think. Different arrangements produce different insights and different blind spots. The symposium worked brilliantly within its constraints, but could not transcend them completely. Modern universities still carry echoes of the symposium, though the wine has been replaced with coffee and the reclining with uncomfortable chairs. Academic conferences retain the basic structure: gathering, presenting ideas, challenging arguments, defending positions. The competitive edge remains. Scholars still build reputations through verbal performance. Publishing matters, but so does the ability to hold your ground during questions. This direct lineage is undeniable. But something essential was lost in translation. The modern academy operates under professional hierarchy. Junior researchers cannot freely challenge senior professors without career consequences. Tenure decisions loom. Grant funding depends on relationships. Institutional politics constrain intellectual risk. The symposium's temporary flattening of status cannot be replicated when tomorrow's consequences are permanent. This reveals what made the ancient practice genuinely unique. For several hours, normal social order softened. A younger man could challenge an elder. A less wealthy citizen could defeat a richer one through argument alone. Winning depended on performance in that moment, not accumulated social capital. This created rare intellectual freedom. Contemporary philosophy seminars attempt something similar. Ideas are supposed to be evaluated on merit, not speaker identity. But the attempt never fully succeeds. We know who holds power. We adjust our challenges accordingly. The symposium worked differently because intoxication and shared physical vulnerability genuinely leveled the field. Everyone was equally off balance. This matters beyond nostalgia. It suggests that certain kinds of thinking require specific social conditions. Not just any gathering produces philosophy. Not just any conversation generates lasting ideas. The symposium succeeded because it combined elements that rarely coexist: intellectual rigor and social loosening, competition and camaraderie, seriousness and absurdity. Modern attempts to recreate these conditions often fail because they try to preserve only the respectable parts. Academic dinners feature wine but demand sobriety. Conferences encourage debate but punish genuine conflict. We want the intellectual output without the messy social process that produced it. This rarely works. The symposium also reminds us that exclusion and insight are not opposites. The practice generated remarkable philosophy precisely because it restricted participation. Shared assumptions accelerated communication. Common references made shortcuts possible. Everyone understood the rules, the texts, the cultural context. This homogeneity enabled depth. But that same restriction limited what could be thought. Questions that required different perspectives went unasked. Challenges that needed alternative experiences never materialized. The symposium explored certain territories brilliantly, while remaining blind to others. Both aspects were real simultaneously. This creates an uncomfortable tension. We cannot simply celebrate ancient Greek philosophy while ignoring how it was produced. The brilliant ideas and the restricted participation are historically inseparable. Recognizing this does not mean dismissing the ideas. It means understanding them as products of specific, limited social arrangements rather than universal human reason. Contemporary philosophy struggles with this legacy. Opening the discipline to previously excluded voices changes what questions get asked, what problems seem important, what solutions appear obvious. This is not distortion, it is expansion. The symposium showed what free male citizens could discover together. A broader practice reveals what humanity can discover together. Yet we should not imagine that simply including more people automatically produces better philosophy. The symposium worked because it was structured, disciplined, and demanding. Participation required preparation, skill, and willingness to be challenged. Expanding access means extending those demands, not lowering them. More voices matter only if those voices engage seriously with difficult questions. The physical aspects of the symposium also shaped outcomes in ways we often ignore. Reclining created specific body positions that affected breathing, digestion, and alertness. Wine altered neurochemistry in measurable ways. Music and rhythm influenced group dynamics. These were not incidental details. They were part of the mechanism. Modern philosophy happens mostly while sitting in chairs, entirely sober, in quiet rooms. This produces different thinking. Not necessarily worse, but different. We have gained precision and rigor. We have lost certain kinds of spontaneity and association. Both trade-offs are real. Some contemporary philosophers experiment with alternative formats, walking seminars, outdoor discussions, less formal gatherings. These attempts recognize that changing physical conditions changes intellectual possibilities, but they rarely go far enough. Academic professionalism resists anything that might appear undignified or uncontrolled. The symposium's relationship to writing also matters. Most symposium conversations were never recorded. What survived was edited, cleaned up, and filtered through later authors with their own agendas. Plato's dialogues are not transcripts. They are literary reconstructions that preserve certain ideas while discarding others. We do not know what most symposia actually sounded like. This should make us cautious about romanticizing the practice. We have access to the successes, the moments that seemed worth preserving, the failures, the boring evenings, the pointless arguments vanished without record. Selection bias operates powerfully across centuries. We see what worked, not what was attempted. Modern academic publishing creates similar distortions. We read finished papers, not the messy thinking that produced them. We see polished arguments, not the false starts and abandoned ideas. This makes progress appear smoother than it actually was. The symposium at least acknowledged that thinking was messy, social, and often ridiculous. Gender remains the most glaring exclusion. Ancient Greek women were not merely absent from symposia. They were deliberately kept away. This was not accidental or incidental. It was essential to how the practice functioned. Men gathered without women specifically to create a space where certain kinds of male bonding and competition could occur. This raises difficult questions about philosophy's origins. If foundational texts emerged from male-only gatherings designed to reinforce male solidarity, what does that mean for the discipline's basic concepts? How much of what we call universal human reason is actually particular male experience generalized inappropriately? These questions do not have simple answers. Philosophy addresses genuine problems that transcend specific social arrangements. Truth, justice, knowledge, and meaning matter regardless of who discusses them. But how problems are framed, what solutions seem obvious, what objections appear relevant, all depend partly on who participates. Including women in philosophical conversation did not just add female voices to existing discussions. It changed what counted as philosophical questions. Personal experience became relevant. Emotion gained philosophical legitimacy. Care, relationship, and embodiment emerged as serious topics. The discipline expanded by admitting previously excluded perspectives. Similar expansions followed other inclusions. Different classes, different cultures, different historical experiences all brought new questions and challenged old assumptions. This was not relativism or fragmentation. It was recognition that human thinking is always situated, always partial, always limited by perspective. The symposium's legacy is therefore genuinely mixed. It gave Western philosophy distinctive characteristics that still shape how we think. Argument matters. Evidence counts. Clarity is valued. These are genuine achievements. But the practice also embedded limitations that took centuries to recognize. Homogeneity was mistaken for universality. Particular experiences were treated as general truths. Exclusion was naturalized rather than questioned. Understanding this mixed inheritance matters for anyone engaging with philosophical tradition. We cannot simply accept ancient ideas uncritically, but we also cannot dismiss them entirely. The challenge involves extracting insights while recognizing their limits. This requires historical awareness, critical distance, and intellectual humility. Perhaps most importantly, the symposium teaches us that intellectual practices are never neutral. How we organize thinking shapes what we can think. Physical arrangements matter. Social structures constrain possibilities. Who participates determines what gets explored. These are not just background conditions. They are part of the thinking itself. Different arrangements produce different insights and different blind spots. The symposium worked brilliantly within its constraints, but could not transcend them completely. Modern philosophy has different constraints, creating different possibilities and different limitations. Recognizing this prevents us from imagining any single arrangement as ideal. What survives most clearly from ancient symposia is the conviction that philosophy happens through conversation. Ideas need testing against other minds. Arguments require challenge. Thinking benefits from friction. This insight transcends the specific social form that produced it. We can preserve the core while changing the container. Contemporary philosophy is slowly creating new forms that retain symposium virtues while addressing its exclusions. Online discussions reach global participants. Video conferences connect distant thinkers. Collaborative writing projects involve multiple perspectives. These innovations are not replacements, but extensions, ways of preserving what worked while expanding who participates. The deepest legacy may be the simplest. Ideas matter enough to argue about. Thinking is worth doing carefully. Philosophy can be rigorous and social simultaneously. These convictions animated the symposium and continue animating philosophy today. The forms change, but the commitment persists. Looking back across centuries, the symposium appears both foreign and familiar. We no longer recline while drinking undiluted wine and debating virtue, but we still gather to test ideas, challenge assumptions, and think together. The specific practice evolved, but the impulse behind it remains recognizable. Understanding where philosophy came from helps us imagine where it might go. The symposium was not the only possible arrangement. It was one solution to the problem of how to think together seriously. Other cultures developed different solutions. Future philosophers will develop new ones. None are final or perfect. What matters is maintaining the core commitment, thinking carefully about difficult questions in ways that allow challenge, revision, and growth. Whether this happens while reclining or sitting, drunk or sober, in person or online, matters less than whether it happens rigorously and honestly. The symposium showed one way. We are still discovering others. Today we confront the symposium not as relic, but as mirror. These gatherings shaped not just ancient philosophy, but how we still approach intellectual exchange thousands of years later. The patterns embedded in those wine-soaked evenings echo through lecture halls, academic conferences, and online debates. Understanding this lineage means recognizing both inheritance and responsibility. The symposium established argument as central to truth-seeking. Ideas gained validity through testing rather than assertion. This remains foundational. Modern academia still operates on peer review, challenge, and revision. Papers are scrutinized, theories questioned, assumptions probed. The symposium proved that thinking alone is insufficient. Thinking requires friction. But the symposium also normalized exclusion as prerequisite for serious thought. By restricting participation to specific groups, it conflated particular perspectives with universal truth. This distortion persisted for centuries. Philosophy claimed objectivity while maintaining structural barriers that determined who could philosophize. The result was not universal wisdom, but partial insight mistaken for completeness. Contemporary intellectual culture inherits both legacies. We retain the symposium's emphasis on rigorous debate while slowly dismantling its social restrictions. Philosophy departments now include voices historically excluded. Online platforms allow global participation. Ideas circulate beyond elite gatherings. This expansion reveals how much was missed when conversation remained confined. Yet old patterns resist change. Academic hierarchies still determine whose ideas receive attention. Informal networks shape whose work gets cited. Language barriers restrict access. Economic inequality limits participation. The symposium's ghost lingers in structures that claim openness while maintaining gatekeeping mechanisms. The wine itself carries symbolic weight. Alcohol loosened restraint, but also obscured judgment. Some brilliant insights emerged from symposia. So did confident nonsense. The challenge involves separating genuine breakthroughs from wine-fueled delusion. This distinction matters because philosophy still struggles with its relationship to performance, spectacle, and social validation. Modern conferences replicate symposium dynamics surprisingly closely. Speakers perform ideas before audiences. Questions become territorial disputes. Networking matters as much as content. Alcohol still flows at receptions, where hierarchy softens slightly but never disappears. The symposium modernized without fundamentally transforming. What changed most dramatically is documentation. Ancient symposia left few records beyond philosophical texts that cleaned up messy conversations. Today, everything is recorded, transcribed, published online. This transparency reveals how intellectual progress actually happens. Slowly, chaotically, through repetition and correction, rather than sudden revelation. The symposium also established philosophy as masculine endeavor. This was not accidental byproduct, but deliberate construction. Excluding women created particular intellectual culture that valued certain forms of argument, specific types of reasoning, and defined rationality narrowly. Recovering what was lost requires more than adding women to existing structures. It requires questioning whether those structures themselves encode bias. Recent scholarship explores how gender shaped philosophical method. Questions asked differently, priorities valued alternatively, relationships understood through different frameworks. This is not relativism. It is recognition that perspective matters. The symposium claimed universal truth while operating from a particular standpoint. Acknowledging this opens space for genuinely broader philosophical inquiry. The physical arrangement mattered more than typically acknowledged. Reclining created specific power dynamics. Eye contact, forced engagement. Wine removed inhibitions. Servants maintained hierarchy even as conversation claimed equality. These details were not incidental. They shaped what could be thought and how ideas circulated. Philosophy happened in bodies, not pure minds. Modern philosophy often forgets embodiment. Texts are treated as disembodied arguments. But the symposium reminds us that thinking always occurs somewhere, in specific physical contexts, with particular social arrangements. Changing those contexts changes what becomes thinkable. Online philosophy creates different possibilities than conference rooms. Collaborative documents enable different exchanges than lectures. The symposium's greatest limitation was mistaking specific arrangement for ideal form. Because this structure produced valuable philosophy, participants assumed it was the only structure capable of doing so. This error repeats whenever successful practices become dogma. The question is not whether symposia worked, but whether other arrangements might work differently. Contemporary philosophy experiments with alternative formats. Workshops emphasize collaboration over debate. Online forums allow asynchronous reflection. Public philosophy engages broader audiences. Each format reveals different insights and creates different blind spots. No single arrangement captures everything worth thinking about. The symposium also established certain topics as worthy of philosophical attention, while dismissing others. Abstract questions about virtue received serious treatment. Practical concerns about daily life were relegated to lesser status. This hierarchy persists. Academic philosophy still privileges certain questions while treating others as unphilosophical. The symposium's influence extends beyond method into content. Feminist philosophy challenged this hierarchy by insisting that personal is philosophical. Questions about care, relationship, embodiment, and emotion deserve rigorous analysis. The symposium's dismissal of these topics reflected not their inherent unworthiness, but the social position of those doing the dismissing. Broadening who participates necessarily broadens what counts as philosophy. The relationship between intoxication and insight deserves examination. The symposium assumed wine revealed truth by removing inhibition. But alcohol also impairs judgment, creates false confidence, and produces ideas that seem profound until morning. Philosophy still wrestles with this tension. When does loosening, rigid thinking become sloppy reasoning? Some cultures developed philosophical traditions without symposium-style intoxication. Buddhist philosophy emerged from meditation rather than wine. Confucian thought emphasized ritual sobriety. African philosophical traditions often centered community dialogue without alcohol. These alternatives prove the symposium was one option among many, not inevitable structure for serious thought. The symposium's legacy includes both its insights and its violence. The same gatherings that produced brilliant philosophy also reinforced social hierarchies, legitimized exclusion, and normalized particular forms of intellectual aggression as universal standards. Honoring this history means acknowledging both dimensions without excusing either. Modern efforts to reform philosophical practice must grapple with this complexity. Simply adding diversity to existing structures proves insufficient when those structures encode problematic assumptions. But completely rejecting symposium legacy throws away genuine achievements. The path forward involves critical engagement rather than wholesale acceptance or rejection. The most radical inheritance might be the conviction that philosophy matters enough to argue about. This belief transcends specific social forms. Whether symposium, seminar, online forum, or public dialogue, philosophy assumes ideas have consequences worth debating. This commitment remains valuable even as we transform how debate occurs. The symposium demonstrated that thinking together produces different results than thinking alone. Ideas tested against other minds strengthen or fail in ways solitary reflection cannot achieve. This insight justifies continued emphasis on philosophical community. But community can take infinite forms. The symposium was beginning, not endpoint. Looking forward, philosophy faces questions the symposium never imagined. How do we think together across vast distances? How do we maintain rigor while welcoming diverse perspectives? How do we balance critique with generosity? How do we preserve intellectual standards without weaponizing them against newcomers? These challenges require innovation beyond symposium framework. Technology enables new philosophical possibilities. Video conferences connect distant thinkers. Collaborative documents allow simultaneous contribution. Online platforms democratize access. These tools create opportunities the symposium never offered. They also introduce new problems. Harassment replaces exclusion. Information overload replaces scarcity. Attention becomes fragmented. The symposium reminds us that intellectual practices are never neutral. How we organize thinking shapes what we can think. Physical space, social relations, power dynamics all influence philosophical possibility. Changing these conditions changes philosophy itself. This is not corruption of pure thought, but recognition that thought always occurs in context. Perhaps the deepest lesson involves humility. The symposium participants believed they were discovering eternal truths. Instead, they were exploring questions from particular perspective, shaped by specific circumstances. Their insights remain valuable, but partial. Every philosophical tradition operates under similar constraints. None achieve complete objectivity. This realization need not lead to despair. Partial perspectives can still generate genuine knowledge. Multiple partial views together create richer understanding than any single, complete view could provide. The goal is not transcending perspective, but multiplying perspectives thoughtfully. The symposium matters not because it was perfect, but because it was ambitious. It took ideas seriously enough to organize social life around their discussion. It valued argument highly enough to create elaborate rituals supporting it. It believed thinking together could improve individual thinking. These commitments remain worth preserving. What requires transformation is the assumption that one social form exhausts philosophical possibility. The symposium worked for its context. Other contexts require other forms. Philosophy thrives through adaptation, not preservation. The question is not whether to maintain symposium traditions, but how to honor their core insights while creating new structures suited for different challenges. The wine-soaked evenings of ancient Greece produced philosophy that still shapes how we think. But those evenings were never the only way to think seriously. Other cultures developed alternative approaches. Future philosophers will develop new ones. The symposium's true legacy is not its specific form, but its demonstration that form matters. How we organize intellectual exchange determines what exchanges become possible. Contemporary philosophy stands at a threshold. We can reproduce symposium patterns with superficial modifications, adding diversity to unchanged structures. Or we can fundamentally reimagine how philosophical community operates. The second path is harder but necessary. It requires questioning assumptions so deeply embedded they feel like logic itself. The symposium teaches that philosophy happens through conversation. This remains true, but conversation takes infinite forms. The challenge involves discovering which forms serve inquiry best while excluding people least. This is not merely a practical question, but philosophical one. How we organize thinking reflects what we believe thinking is for. The ancient Greeks were not wrong to value rigorous debate, careful argument, and intellectual challenge. These remain crucial. What they got wrong was assuming these values required specific social arrangements that excluded most humans. We now know better. The question is whether we will act on that knowledge. Philosophy moves forward not by rejecting its past, but by understanding it critically. The symposium shaped Western thought profoundly. That influence cannot be undone. But it can be examined, questioned, and transformed. We inherit not just ideas, but practices, not just arguments, but assumptions about who can make them. The wine has long since evaporated. The couches have crumbled. The participants are dust. What remains is a question they thought they had answered, but actually only began asking, how do we think together well? The symposium offered one response. We must offer others. The symposium never really ended. It just changed shape, moved locations, adopted different customs. The basic impulse persisted across centuries, even as the specific practice dissolved. Humans continued gathering to test ideas against one another, to argue until clarity emerged or exhaustion arrived, to discover through conversation what solitary thought could not reveal. What died was not the need for intellectual friction, but the particular social arrangement that ancient Greeks built around it. The reclining, the wine-mixing rituals, the all-male exclusivity, the assumption that one city's practices represented universal human reason. These specifics belonged to their moment and could not survive contact with broader realities. But something essential transferred across that dissolution. The conviction that ideas improve through challenge, that thinking benefits from resistance, that philosophy requires community even when community creates discomfort. These principles outlasted the symposium itself, embedding themselves in how Western culture approaches knowledge. Modern universities inherited this without fully understanding what they received. Academic departments reproduce symposium dynamics unconsciously. Seminars mimic the conversational structure. Peer review replicates the testing function. Conferences gather minds for intensive exchange. The forms evolved, but the underlying pattern remained recognizable. Yet the inheritance came packaged with limitations. The same structures that enabled rigorous thinking also encoded exclusions. Who counted as capable of philosophy? What questions deserved serious attention? Which styles of argument registered as legitimate? The symposium's answers to these questions were never neutral. They reflected specific social arrangements masquerading as natural order. Recognizing this does not require rejecting everything the symposium produced. Greek philosophy generated genuine insights about logic, ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. Those contributions remain valuable, but they emerged from particular context, not universal human nature. Understanding that context reveals both the achievements and the constraints. The challenge facing contemporary philosophy involves preserving what worked while dismantling what didn't, maintaining commitment to rigorous argument while expanding who can argue, valuing intellectual challenge while questioning whose challenges were historically welcomed. This is not simple addition of diverse voices to unchanged practices. It requires examining whether the practices themselves need transformation. Some resistance comes from genuine concern about standards. If philosophy opens to previously excluded perspectives, does it risk losing coherence? If alternative styles of reasoning gain legitimacy, does rigorous thinking suffer? These questions deserve serious engagement rather than dismissal, but they often mask deeper anxieties. Change threatens those who succeeded under old arrangements. Broadening participation redistributes authority. New voices ask different questions that make familiar territory unfamiliar. This discomfort is real, but not necessarily evidence that standards are declining. Sometimes discomfort signals that assumptions are finally being questioned. The symposium demonstrates that intellectual traditions always exist in tension with their social foundations. Brilliant insights emerge alongside systematic exclusions. Rigorous methods coexist with arbitrary restrictions. Progress and limitation are not opposites, but partners, shaping each other continuously. This means there is no pure philosophical tradition to recover or defend. Every approach carries historical baggage. Every method reflects choices about what matters and who decides. The symposium made specific choices that enabled specific achievements while preventing others. Modern philosophy makes different choices with different consequences. What we can learn from the symposium is not what to think, but how to think about thinking itself. Intellectual practices are constructions, not discoveries. They serve purposes, embody values, reflect power arrangements. Making these dimensions visible allows conscious choice about what to preserve, what to modify, what to abandon entirely. The wine symbolizes this complexity perfectly. It was never just alcohol. It represented loosening of normal constraints, temporary suspension of hierarchy, permission to speak dangerously. These functions mattered. They enabled conversations that rigid sobriety might have prevented. But wine also obscured judgment, inflated confidence, and created false sense of profundity. Modern philosophy mostly abandoned literal intoxication while retaining metaphorical versions. We still seek ways to loosen rigid thinking, to create spaces where unconventional ideas feel safe, to temporarily suspend judgment for exploration. But we pursue these goals through different means: interdisciplinary work, thought experiments, creative speculation, deliberate perspective shifting. These alternatives work differently than wine. They produce different kinds of insights and different kinds of errors. No single method captures everything worth thinking about. The symposium's mistake was imagining its approach was the only valid one. Our mistake would be repeating that error with contemporary methods. The physical dimension also matters more than philosophy typically acknowledges. The symposium happened in bodies, in specific postures, with particular sensory experiences. Reclining affected thinking differently than sitting upright. Wine altered consciousness in measurable ways. Music and rhythm shaped group dynamics. These were not decorative elements, but functional components. Modern philosophy occurs in different physical contexts: conference rooms, office hours, email exchanges, video calls. Each setting enables and constrains differently. Online discussion allows asynchronous reflection, but loses immediate response. In-person gatherings create energy but restrict who can attend. Physical presence matters but differently than ancient Greeks imagined. The exclusion of women remains the symposium's most glaring failure. This was not incidental oversight, but structural requirement. The practice functioned specifically through homosocial bonding among free men. Including women would have disrupted the social dynamics that participants valued. This means the philosophy produced cannot be separated from the exclusion that enabled it. Contemporary philosophy must grapple with this legacy honestly. Adding women to existing structures proves insufficient when those structures encode masculine norms as universal standards. Genuine inclusion requires examining whether the standards themselves reflect bias. This is uncomfortable work, but necessary. Similar analysis applies to other exclusions. Class shaped who could participate. Citizenship determined access. Language created barriers. Each restriction influenced what questions were asked, what answers seemed obvious, what objections appeared relevant. Philosophy claimed universal truth while operating from narrow base. Broadening that base does not dilute philosophy. It strengthens it by testing ideas against wider range of experiences and perspectives. Truth claims that survive diverse challenge are more robust than those tested only against similar viewpoints. The symposium's homogeneity was weakness, not strength, even though it sometimes felt like the opposite. The relationship between philosophy and performance deserves attention. The symposium was theatrical. Participants performed their thinking for audience of peers. Success meant not just having good ideas, but presenting them effectively. This performance dimension never disappeared. Academic philosophy still rewards certain presentation styles, certain ways of speaking and writing. This is not inherently problematic. Ideas benefit from clear articulation. But when specific performance styles become gatekeeping mechanisms, when particular ways of speaking are treated as inherently more rational, then form becomes barrier. Philosophy should be accessible to diverse communication styles while maintaining intellectual rigor. These goals are compatible. The symposium also reveals philosophy's social nature in ways contemporary practice sometimes obscures. Ideas emerge from interaction, not isolation. Thinking happens in dialogue, through challenge and response. Philosophical progress is collective achievement, even when individual names get attached. The symposium made this visible through its very structure. Modern academic culture often hides this reality. Papers are single-authored. Credit goes to individuals. Competition overshadows collaboration. But the actual process remains social. Ideas develop through conversations, workshops, conferences, informal exchanges. The symposium reminds us that this social dimension is not incidental, but essential. Perhaps the deepest lesson involves recognizing that every intellectual practice is historical experiment. The symposium was not inevitable or natural. It was invented, refined through use, and eventually transformed beyond recognition. Other cultures developed different experiments with different results. Future philosophers will develop new ones. This means current practices are not final either. How we currently organize philosophical inquiry is one option among many possible arrangements. It serves some purposes well, others poorly. It includes some voices while excluding others. It enables certain insights while obscuring alternatives. Recognizing this opens space for deliberate innovation. The symposium worked for its context, but that context no longer exists. Ancient Greek society, with its particular social structures, economic arrangements, and cultural assumptions, is gone. Trying to recreate symposium conditions exactly would be impossible and pointless. But understanding what made it work reveals principles that might transfer to different contexts. Those principles include intellectual challenge matters, thinking benefits from friction, ideas need testing against other minds, social arrangements shape intellectual possibilities, physical conditions influence thought, exclusion limits insight, homogeneity creates blind spots, diversity strengthens inquiry. These insights survive even as specific practices evolve. Contemporary philosophy faces challenges the symposium never imagined. Global communication, digital technology, environmental crisis, inequality, complexity. These demand new intellectual tools, new ways of thinking together, new forms of philosophical community. The symposium cannot provide direct answers, but it can remind us that form matters, that how we organize thinking shapes what we can think. The wine-soaked evenings of ancient Greece are not model to replicate, but experiment to learn from. They show that serious intellectual work can happen in unexpected ways, that loosening certain constraints enables insights, that social interaction drives philosophical progress, that form and content are inseparable. They also show that brilliant insights coexist with serious limitations. That exclusion distorts truth claims. That partial perspective masquerades as universality. That power shapes what counts as knowledge. These lessons matter as much as the positive ones. Looking forward, philosophy must invent new practices suited for contemporary challenges. These will not resemble symposia exactly, but will share core commitments. Testing ideas publicly, welcoming challenge, creating spaces for difficult conversations, maintaining rigor while expanding access, honoring tradition while questioning its limits. The symposium's greatest gift might be demonstrating that intellectual traditions are human creations, not natural facts. This means they can be changed, deliberately, thoughtfully, with attention to what serves inquiry and what serves only inertia. Philosophy's future will not look like its past, but it need not abandon everything the past discovered. The ancient Greeks were right that philosophy requires conversation. They were wrong about who should be allowed to converse. We can preserve the insight while rejecting the restriction. This is not betrayal of tradition, but fulfillment of its deepest commitment. Following arguments wherever they lead, even when they lead to questioning the tradition itself. The symposium ended centuries ago, but the questions it raised persist. How do we think together well? What conditions enable genuine inquiry? Who should participate in philosophical conversation? What counts as legitimate reasoning? These questions have no final answers because contexts keep changing. Each generation must answer anew. What remains constant is the need to answer seriously, to take thinking seriously enough to organize practices around it, to value truth enough to create spaces for its pursuit, to recognize that pursuit is collective, ongoing, never complete. The symposium showed one way to do this. We must show others. The couches are gone, the wine evaporated, the voices silent. But the impulse they represented persists. Humans still gather to think together, to test ideas, to argue toward understanding. The forms change endlessly, but the commitment endures. Philosophy continues, not despite the symposium's end, but because its core insight survived. Thinking matters, conversation helps, and truth emerges. Not from isolated minds, but from minds in friction. That insight alone justifies remembering these ancient gatherings. Not to romanticize them or recreate them, but to understand what they revealed about how thinking works. Philosophy is social practice before it is written doctrine. It happens between people before it happens on pages. The symposium made this visible in ways that still illuminate. So when you imagine ancient Greek philosophy, picture not just the polished dialogues that survived, but the messy evenings that produced them. The spilled wine, the overlapping arguments, the confident assertions that seemed brilliant at midnight and absurd by morning. The gradual refinement through repetition. The slow emergence of clarity from chaos. That is where philosophy actually happens. Not in perfect reasoning, but in imperfect conversation, gradually improving, through challenge and correction. The symposium was not ideal practice, but it was honest about what practice involves. Humans thinking together, making mistakes, correcting each other, slowly building understanding from flawed materials. We inherit both the achievements and the flaws, both the insights and the exclusions, both the brilliant questions and the limited perspectives. The task is not choosing between them, but acknowledging both while working towards something better. Philosophy that maintains rigor while expanding access. That values tradition while questioning its limits. That honors past achievements while refusing to be bound by past restrictions. The symposium cannot tell us how to do this, but it can remind us why it matters. Because thinking is difficult, important work that humans must do together. Because truth requires testing. Because understanding emerges from friction. Because philosophy, at its best, is conversation aimed at wisdom, even when wisdom remains just beyond reach. That conversation continues. Different voices now, different languages, different concerns, but the same underlying commitment. The same willingness to argue, challenge, revise, and try again. The same faith that thinking together yields insights that thinking alone cannot achieve. This is what survives from those ancient evenings. Not the wine or the couches or the all-male gatherings, but the conviction that ideas matter enough to argue about, that truth is worth pursuing collectively, and that philosophy happens not in isolation, but in community, however imperfect that community might be. The symposium is dead. Long live the conversation.